Hi, I'm Jareth Fenlorne, and at our family's annual gathering in Blackstone Valley, my uncles called me a family parasite right to my face. Uncle Roderick smirked as he said I'd been living off the family name for years, contributing nothing. Uncle Garrett nodded in agreement, adding that I was just waiting for handouts like a vulture. The entire room, cousins, aunts, even the hired staff, watched in uncomfortable silence. What hurt most wasn't the insult. It was that nobody defended me. They all just sat there, letting it happen. I smiled, stood up quietly, and walked out of that marble-columned mansion without saying a word. But 3 days later, something happened that changed everything. The family attorney called an emergency meeting. What he read from that sealed envelope didn't just shock them, it destroyed their entire world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Fenlorne family had always been complicated, but I never expected it to destroy me the way it did. My name is Jareth Fenlorne, and for 28 years I believed I understood my place in our family's intricate web of relationships, businesses, and old money traditions. Our family story began in the 1920s when my great-grandfather, Theodore Fenlorne, built the first grandeur hotels property in downtown Millhaven. What started as a single luxury hotel became an empire spanning 3 states. The flagship property, Grandeur Millhaven, still dominated the city's skyline with its Art Deco architecture and reputation for hosting politicians, celebrities, and business moguls. Growing up, I spent countless summers in that hotel. I knew every corridor, every secret passage the staff used, every creaking floorboard in the penthouse suite. The concierge, a gentleman named William who had worked there for 40 years, would sneak me pastries from the kitchen and tell me stories about famous guests who had stayed there decades before I was born. My father, Elwayne Fenlorne, had been the middle son in his generation. Uncle Roderick was the eldest, commanding and sharp-tongued, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. He carried himself like a man who had never been told no, and in most cases, he probably hadn't been. Uncle Garrett was the youngest, charming in that dangerous way that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. He had inherited the family's political connections and used them to expand the hotel business into new markets. My father had been different. Where his brothers were ruthless businessmen, Dad was the dreamer, the one who saw hospitality as an art form rather than just profit margins. He would talk for hours about creating experiences for guests, about making each stay memorable. Uncle Roderick used to roll his eyes during family dinners when Dad would go on about elevating the guest journey and crafting authentic luxury experiences. When I was 15, Dad died in a car accident during a winter storm while driving back from inspecting a potential property in the mountain town of Silver Pine. The loss devastated me, but it also marked the beginning of my uncles taking control of everything. They claimed they were looking out for me, making sure I was taken care of, but I started noticing how decisions about my future were made without consulting me. They enrolled me in boarding school at Westbridge Academy, 3 hours away from Millhaven. "It's what your father would have wanted," Uncle Roderick told me, though I remembered Dad specifically saying he thought boarding schools were places where rich families sent their problems to be someone else's responsibility. When I graduated, they insisted I study business at Thornfield University, not because they asked what I wanted to study, but because it would be useful for the family business. During my college years, I spent every summer and winter break working at various Grandeur Hotels properties. I wasn't given cushy management positions or executive internships like the sons of other wealthy families might expect. Instead, I started in housekeeping at the Grandeur Ashford, cleaning rooms and learning the hotel business from the ground up. I worked front desk at Grandeur Westport, dealing with difficult guests and managing reservations. I spent a summer in food service at Grandeur Lakeside, learning everything from food safety protocols to wine pairings. My uncles said this was character building, that I needed to understand every aspect of the business before I could contribute meaningfully to its leadership. At the time, I thought they were being wise mentors, preparing me for an eventual role in the company. I was grateful for the experience, even when I was exhausted from working double shifts and studying for my business degree simultaneously. After graduation, I moved back to Millhaven and took a position as operations coordinator at the flagship hotel. The job involved everything from scheduling maintenance to coordinating with vendors to managing special events. It wasn't glamorous, but I threw myself into it with enthusiasm. I reorganized the entire procurement system, saving the hotel thousands of dollars annually on supplies. I developed new training protocols for housekeeping staff that improved both efficiency and guest satisfaction scores. I also started noticing things that didn't make sense, invoices that seemed inflated, contractors who were paid premium rates for subpar work, vendor relationships that appeared to benefit certain people more than the hotel itself. When I brought these concerns to Uncle Roderick, he would dismiss them with a wave of his hand. "You're still learning the business, Jareth," he would say in that condescending tone that made my teeth clench. "These relationships have been built over decades. You don't understand the full picture yet." Uncle Garrett was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "I appreciate your attention to detail," he would tell me, "but we need you focusing on your assigned responsibilities, not questioning established systems." I lived in a modest apartment in Millhaven's Arts District, paying my own rent despite the family's wealth. My uncles had made it clear that I needed to earn my place and prove my worth before I could expect any special treatment. I drove a used sedan, while my cousins, Uncle Roderick's twin daughters Callista and Leora, drove luxury cars their father had bought them. They worked part-time at the hotel's marketing department when it was convenient for them, but spent most of their time traveling or attending social events. The disparity didn't bother me initially. I believed hard work and dedication would eventually be recognized and rewarded. I thought I was building something, proving myself worthy of the family legacy my father had left behind. During family gatherings, I would listen to discussions about business strategy, expansion plans, and investment opportunities. My uncles would talk about opening new properties, acquiring competitors, and expanding into international markets. When I tried to contribute ideas or suggestions based on my operational experience, they would nod politely and then continue their conversation as if I hadn't spoken. "Let the adults handle the big picture, Jareth," Uncle Roderick said once after I suggested we invest in modernizing our reservation systems. "You focus on keeping the day-to-day operations running smoothly." I started keeping detailed notes about everything I observed. Not because I suspected anything sinister, but because I wanted to understand the business well enough to eventually contribute meaningfully to those strategic conversations. I documented inefficiencies, researched industry best practices, and developed proposals for improvements that I hoped would eventually be taken seriously. What I didn't realize was how carefully my uncles were managing my perception of the family's financial situation. They spoke about the business as if it was successful but not extraordinarily wealthy. They mentioned challenges with competition, rising costs, and market pressures. They positioned themselves as hard-working stewards of a respectable, but not spectacular family enterprise. The truth was far different, and I wouldn't discover it until much later. The Grandeur Hotels chain wasn't just successful, it was phenomenally profitable, with properties in prime locations across 3 states generating massive revenue streams. The family trust that held these assets was worth far more than anyone had ever indicated to me. But in those years leading up to that devastating family gathering in Blackstone Valley, I remained naive about the scope of what I stood to inherit and the lengths to which my uncles were going to ensure I never found out. By my 25th birthday, I had become indispensable to the daily operations of Grandeur Hotels, though my uncles would never admit it. What started as entry-level positions had evolved into me essentially running the operational side of 3 properties, while being paid a salary that barely covered my modest lifestyle. My typical day began at 6 a.m. when I would arrive at the Grandeur Millhaven to review overnight reports from all 3 properties I oversaw. The night managers would email summaries of any issues, guest complaints, maintenance problems, staffing challenges, unusual incidents. I had developed a system for categorizing and prioritizing these reports, ensuring that critical issues were addressed immediately, while minor concerns were scheduled appropriately. The scope of my responsibilities had grown organically, mainly because I was the only family member who seemed interested in the operational details that kept the hotels running smoothly. While my cousins Callista and Leora focused on marketing events and social media presence, I was handling vendor negotiations, staff scheduling, quality control inspections, and guest services management. I had restructured the housekeeping protocols across all properties, reducing average room turnover time by 15 minutes while improving cleanliness scores. This might sound like a minor improvement, but across hundreds of rooms daily, It translated to significant efficiency gains and cost savings. I had also renegotiated contracts with 3 major suppliers, saving the hotels approximately $40,000 annually. When the Grandeur Westport needed a new food service manager, I spent 2 weeks interviewing candidates and developing training materials. When the Grandeur Ashford's HVAC system failed during peak summer season, I coordinated emergency repairs and temporary solutions that prevented guest comfort issues and potential booking cancellations. My uncles acknowledged these contributions with brief comments like "good work" or "keep it up," but there was never any discussion of increased compensation, official promotions, or recognition of my growing expertise. When other employees asked about my title, I honestly didn't know what to tell them. Officially, I was still listed as Operations Coordinator, but my actual responsibilities encompassed facilities management, vendor relations, staff supervision, and strategic planning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During this period, I also started noticing patterns that troubled me. The hotels were clearly generating substantial revenue. I could see the booking numbers, occupancy rates, and average daily rates, but conversations with my uncles always emphasized financial pressures and modest profits. They spoke about the business as if it was barely breaking even, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. I began keeping more detailed records, not out of suspicion but out of a desire to understand the business better. I wanted to contribute to strategic planning conversations, but I felt like I needed more comprehensive knowledge about our financial performance to make meaningful suggestions. What I discovered was puzzling. Our occupancy rates consistently exceeded industry averages. Our premium suites were booked months in advance. Corporate clients paid significant rates for conference facilities and extended stays. The restaurants in our hotels were profitable standalone operations that enhanced our reputation and generated additional revenue streams. Yet somehow, according to my uncles, the family business was just getting by. They claimed that operational costs, maintenance expenses, and market pressures kept profit margins razor thin. This explanation didn't align with what I observed daily. I started researching comparable hotels in our markets and found that our rates were competitive and our occupancy levels were exceptionally strong. Industry reports suggested that well-managed luxury hotels in our locations should be highly profitable. The disconnect between this research and my uncle's portrayal of our financial situation was significant. Around this time, I made what I thought was a smart decision. I enrolled in evening classes to earn a graduate certificate in hospitality management from Millhaven University. I paid for these classes myself, using savings from my modest salary, because I wanted to bring more expertise to the family business. The program covered advanced topics in hotel operations, financial management, and strategic planning. Through coursework and case studies, I learned about industry benchmarks, profit optimization strategies, and market analysis techniques. This education confirmed my suspicions that Grandeur hotels should be performing much better financially than my uncles claimed. I developed a comprehensive analysis of our properties' performance compared to industry standards. The data suggested we had opportunities to increase revenue through dynamic pricing strategies, enhanced amenities, and targeted marketing campaigns. I also identified several operational inefficiencies that were costing us money unnecessarily. Excited about these findings, I prepared a detailed presentation for my uncles. I spent weeks creating charts, graphs, and recommendations based on solid research and analysis. I was confident that this work would demonstrate my value to the family business and possibly lead to more meaningful involvement in strategic decisions. The meeting to present my analysis was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in Uncle Roderick's office at the Grandeur Millhaven. I arrived with printed materials, a laptop presentation, and genuine enthusiasm about sharing insights that could benefit our hotels. Uncle Roderick listened politely for about 10 minutes before interrupting. "This is all very academic, Jareth," he said, "but you're missing the bigger picture. There are aspects of this business that you don't understand yet." Uncle Garrett nodded in agreement. "Your analysis assumes we want to maximize short-term profits," he added, "but our strategy focuses on long-term stability and family legacy preservation." They dismissed my recommendations without serious consideration, explaining that my perspective was limited by my operational focus and lack of executive experience. They thanked me for the effort, but suggested I concentrate on my assigned responsibilities rather than attempting strategic analysis. I left that meeting feeling deflated and confused. The rejection of my work wasn't just disappointing, it seemed illogical. The improvements I had suggested were based on proven industry practices and solid financial analysis. Their dismissal felt arbitrary and condescending. But I didn't give up. Instead, I doubled down on my commitment to the family business. I worked longer hours, took on additional responsibilities, and continued looking for ways to contribute value. I believed that persistence and dedication would eventually earn me the respect and recognition I thought I deserved. I started arriving earlier and staying later. I took on weekend responsibilities that had previously been handled by hired managers. I responded to after-hours emergencies and guest complaints, building a reputation among staff as someone who was always available and willing to solve problems. During this period, I also began developing personal relationships with long-term employees across all 3 properties. These were people who had worked for the family business for years, some for decades. They knew the history of the hotels, remembered my father, and had observed changes in management over time. Through casual conversations with these employees, I started learning things that my uncles had never mentioned. Stories about how profitable the hotels had been in previous years. Comments about large capital improvements that had been funded without apparent financial strain. Observations about the family's lifestyle and spending patterns that seemed inconsistent with their claims of modest business success. One conversation particularly stood out. William, the veteran concierge at Grandeur Millhaven, mentioned that my father had once told him about long-term financial plans for expanding the hotel chain internationally. "Your father was excited about opportunities in Europe," William said. He had been researching properties in London and Paris. Said the family business was financially positioned to make significant acquisitions. This information contradicted everything my uncles had told me about our financial limitations and conservative growth strategy. It suggested that the family business was not only more profitable than they claimed, but also that there had been ambitious expansion plans that were apparently abandoned after my father's death. I began to wonder whether my uncle's version of our business situation was incomplete or inaccurate. The possibility that I was being deliberately misled hadn't occurred to me yet, but seeds of doubt were beginning to grow. My commitment to proving myself worthy of family leadership intensified. I convinced myself that my uncles were testing my dedication, and that eventually, my hard work would be acknowledged and rewarded with real responsibility and appropriate compensation. This belief sustained me through 3 years of increasingly demanding work with minimal recognition. I sacrificed personal relationships, social activities, and financial security to demonstrate my value to the family business. I believed I was building towards something meaningful, a future where I would be recognized as a legitimate successor to my father's legacy in the hotel industry. What I didn't understand was that my uncles had no intention of sharing real power or wealth with me. My commitment and dedication weren't being evaluated as qualifications for leadership. They were being exploited to extract maximum value from my labor while maintaining their exclusive control over the family's assets. The tragic irony was that the harder I worked to prove myself worthy, the more convinced my uncles became that they could continue taking advantage of my naivete indefinitely. The annual Fenlorne family gathering had always been held at the Blackstone Valley estate, a sprawling property that Uncle Roderick had purchased 10 years earlier. The mansion sat on 200 acres of rolling hills, complete with manicured gardens, a private lake, and guest accommodations that could house our entire extended family for a long weekend. This year's gathering was scheduled for the 3rd weekend in October, when the autumn foliage would be at its peak. Family members would arrive Friday afternoon and stay through Sunday evening, participating in what Uncle Roderick called our opportunity to strengthen family bonds and discuss our shared future. I drove up from Millhaven on Friday afternoon, my car loaded with gifts for my younger cousins and a presentation folder containing updates on the hotels, operational improvements from the past year. Despite previous disappointments, I remained optimistic that this gathering might provide an opportunity to demonstrate my value to the family business and possibly discuss expanded responsibilities. The estate was magnificent in the fall afternoon light. The main house, built in a colonial revival style, featured white columns, black shutters, and perfectly maintained brick facades. The circular driveway was lined with luxury vehicles, Uncle Roderick's black Mercedes, Uncle Garrett's silver BMW, and various high-end cars belonging to other family members. Inside, the house buzzed with familiar voices and the sounds of caterers preparing for the evening's formal dinner. The staff had been hired from a high-end catering company in the state capital, and they moved efficiently through the mansion's spacious rooms, setting up bars, arranging flowers, and preparing elaborate food presentations. I found my room on the second floor, one of the smaller guest bedrooms overlooking the gardens. My cousins Callista and Leora had claimed the larger rooms with lake views, which they considered their right as Uncle Roderick's daughters. I didn't mind the smaller space. I was just grateful to be included in family gatherings. Friday evening's dinner was held in the mansion's formal dining room, which could comfortably seat 24 people. The table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver flatware that probably cost more than I earned in several months. Uncle Roderick sat at the head of the table with Uncle Garrett at the opposite end, positioning themselves as the clear patriarchs of our family. The conversation during dinner focused on general family updates, travel stories, and light business discussion. My cousins shared news about their social activities and career developments. Callista had recently been promoted to marketing director at the hotels, despite having worked there part-time for less than 2 years. Leora announced her engagement to Valentino Roderick, whose family owned several restaurants in the capital city. When the conversation turned to business matters, I tried to contribute insights from my operational experience. I mentioned the successful efficiency improvements at all 3 properties, and the positive guest feedback we had been receiving. My uncles nodded politely but quickly shifted the discussion to other topics. After dinner, family members gathered in the mansion's library for drinks and continued conversation. The room featured floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive fireplace, and comfortable leather furniture arranged in conversational groupings. It was the kind of space that was designed to impress guests and facilitate the sort of important family discussions that wealthy families were supposed to have. Uncle Roderick called for everyone's attention around 10 o'clock. I want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone's contributions to our family's continued success. He began, raising his whiskey glass. This gathering represents not just our family bonds but also our shared commitment to preserving and building upon the legacy that previous generations established. He proceeded to acknowledge various family members' accomplishments over the past year. He praised Callista's marketing initiatives and Leora's upcoming marriage into another prominent family. He recognized Uncle Garrett's success in expanding our political connections and business relationships. He even acknowledged the achievements of younger cousins who were still in college. When he finished his round of acknowledgments, there was a noticeable pause. I realized that he had not mentioned my contributions to the hotel's operations, despite the fact that I had been working more hours and handling more responsibilities than anyone else in our generation. Uncle Roderick, I said, raising my hand slightly, I'd love to share some updates about the operational improvements we've implemented across the properties this year. The room became quiet. Uncle Roderick looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between annoyance and amusement. Jareth, he said slowly, I think everyone here appreciates your dedication to the day-to-day operations, but this gathering is about celebrating family achievements, not work reports. Uncle Garrett chimed in from across the room. Besides, operational work is important, but it's not the same as building strategic value or advancing the family's interests in meaningful ways. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I pressed on. I understand, but I think the work I've been doing has created significant value. The efficiency improvements alone have saved us tens of thousands of dollars, and guest satisfaction scores are at all-time highs across all properties. Uncle Roderick's expression hardened. Jareth, you're missing the point. Saving money on operational costs is fine, but it's not leadership, it's maintenance. Anyone can optimize existing systems if they work hard enough. That's not entirely fair, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. The strategic analysis I presented last year showed opportunities for revenue growth and market expansion that could significantly increase our profitability. Strategic analysis? Uncle Garrett laughed, though not in a friendly way. You mean those academic exercises you put together? Jareth, there's a difference between theoretical knowledge and real business experience. I could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused on this exchange. My cousins looked uncomfortable, but they remained silent. Other family members seemed to be watching with detached curiosity, as if observing a mildly interesting performance. I have been gaining real business experience, I said, my voice becoming strained. I've been working in our hotels for 7 years. I know every aspect of our operations. I've built relationships with staff, vendors, and guests. I've solved problems and implemented improvements that have measurable results. Uncle Roderick stood up. which seemed to signal that this conversation was becoming more serious than he had intended. "Jareth, I think you're overestimating the significance of your contributions. Yes, you work hard. Yes, you handle operational details competently, but you're not building anything new. You're not bringing in major clients or developing strategic partnerships or creating wealth." "I'm not given opportunities to do those things," I replied, standing as well. "Every time I try to contribute strategic ideas or take on larger responsibilities, I'm told I don't understand the bigger picture, or that I need more experience." "Maybe because it's true," Uncle Garrett said, his voice becoming sharper. "Maybe because running hotel operations isn't the same as running a business empire. Maybe because following protocols and optimizing processes isn't the same as creating vision and building legacy." The room had become completely silent except for our voices. I could feel my heart pounding as I realized this conversation was moving in a direction I hadn't anticipated. "I'm not asking to run the entire business," I said. "I'm asking to be recognized for the value I do create, and to be given opportunities to contribute more meaningfully to our family's success." Uncle Roderick looked around the room as if gathering support from other family members. Then he looked directly at me with an expression of complete condescension. "Jareth, here's what I think is happening. I think you've been working in our hotels for so long that you've started to believe you deserve something more than what you've earned. I think you've confused being employed by the family business with being essential to the family business." "That's not true," I protested. "I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned. I'm asking for recognition of what I've already contributed." "Contributed?" Uncle Garrett stood up now too. "Jareth, you've been living off our family's success for years. You've had a job because we gave you one. You've had opportunities because we created them for you. You've had a place in this family business because we allowed it." "I've worked for everything I have," I replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I've earned my place through years of dedicated work and proven results." Uncle Roderick laughed, but it wasn't a warm sound. "Dedicated work? Jareth, you're a family parasite. You've been feeding off the wealth and opportunities that previous generations of this family created, and you've convinced yourself that your modest contributions somehow entitle you to share in the real benefits of family ownership." The words hit me like a physical blow. Family parasite. The phrase seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. "That's completely unfair," I said, though my voice was weaker now. "I've sacrificed years of my life to this business. I've worked harder than anyone else in my generation. I've given up personal opportunities to serve this family's interests." "You've had a job," Uncle Garrett replied coldly. "A job that paid you more than you could have earned anywhere else with your limited qualifications. A job that gave you status and opportunities you never would have had without the family name. And instead of being grateful, you're standing here demanding recognition as if you were an equal partner in this family's success." I looked around the room for support, but every family member was avoiding eye contact. My cousins, who had benefited from family connections and resources far more than I had, remained silent. Aunts and uncles, who had watched me work tirelessly for years, offered no defense. "Nobody here is going to disagree with us, Jareth," Uncle Roderick said, apparently reading my expression. "Because everyone here understands something that you've never grasped. This family's wealth and success belongs to the people who built it and the people who inherit it legitimately. You're not in that category. You're someone we've helped out of family obligation, and you've mistaken our generosity for your birthright." I stood there in that opulent library, surrounded by family members who had just watched me be systematically humiliated, and realized that everything I had believed about my place in this family was wrong. I wasn't being prepared for leadership. I was being exploited. I wasn't earning respect through hard work. I was being tolerated as a convenient source of labor. Without saying another word, I walked out of the library, through the mansion's grand foyer, and into the cool October night. I got in my car and drove back to Millhaven, leaving behind the family gathering and what remained of my illusions about the people I had spent years trying to please. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment in Millhaven, replaying every moment of that humiliating confrontation, trying to understand how I had misread the situation so completely. The words "family parasite" kept echoing in my mind, along with the silence of every family member who had watched my uncles tear down years of my dedicated work without offering a single word in my defense. By sunrise, my hurt had transformed into something more focused. a need to understand the truth about my family's business and my place in it. If my uncles were right, if I really was just a mediocre employee who had been given opportunities beyond my merit, then I needed to accept that reality and plan accordingly. But if they were wrong, if my contributions had been more significant than they acknowledged, then their treatment of me was not just cruel but deliberately deceptive. I made coffee and opened my laptop. Over the past several years, I had accumulated substantial documentation about the hotel's operations, primarily because I had been trying to understand the business well enough to contribute strategically. Now I would use this information differently to determine whether the financial picture my uncles had painted was accurate. I started with basic revenue analysis. I had access to occupancy reports, average daily rates, and booking data for all three properties. I also had records of major expenses, vendor contracts, and staffing costs. What I didn't have was access to the complete financial statements, which were maintained by the corporate office under my uncle's direct control. The revenue numbers told a clear story. Across all three properties, we maintained occupancy rates that consistently exceeded 85%, which was exceptional for luxury hotels in our markets. Our average daily rates were competitive with comparable properties, and our premium suites commanded rates that were among the highest in the region. I calculated gross revenue estimates based on this data and was startled by the results. Even using conservative projections, our three hotels should have been generating well over $15 million annually in room revenue alone. When I added estimates for restaurant sales, event bookings, and ancillary services, the total revenue picture suggested a business that was far more profitable than my uncles had ever indicated. Next, I analyzed our operational costs using the vendor contracts and expense records I had maintained. I found inefficiencies and questionable expenses, but even accounting for these issues, our cost structure shouldn't have eliminated the profit margins that the revenue numbers suggested. The mathematical conclusion was unavoidable. Either my uncles had been dramatically understating the business's profitability, or there were major expenses and costs that I didn't know about. Given their consistent emphasis on modest profits and financial pressures, the former seemed more likely than the latter. I spent the entire weekend digging deeper into every record I could access. I researched comparable hotel properties online, looking for industry benchmarks and performance data. I reviewed trade publications and market analyses that provided insights into typical profit margins for luxury hotels in similar locations. Everything I found confirmed my analysis. Well-managed luxury hotels in prime locations with strong occupancy rates should be highly profitable. Our properties met all the criteria for financial success, yet my uncles consistently portrayed the business as merely breaking even. On Monday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called in sick to work and drove to the offices of Millhaven Public Records, located in the basement of the county courthouse. I wanted to research the ownership structure of our family's properties and see if I could find additional information about their financial value. Property records were public information, but I had never thought to examine them before. I spent hours reviewing deed transfers, tax assessments, and mortgage records related to the Grandeur Hotel's properties. What I discovered was remarkable. The assessed values of our three hotels were far higher than I had expected. The Grandeur Millhaven alone was assessed at over $12 million. And that assessment was several years old. The Grandeur Westport and Grandeur Ashford had similarly high valuations. Combined, the three properties represented assets worth at least $30 million, not including the land, furnishings, and business operations. More interesting were the mortgage records. The properties showed minimal debt relative to their assessed values, which meant that the family owned most of these assets outright. This contradicted my uncle's frequent comments about loan payments and financial obligations that supposedly constrained our cash flow. I also found records of several property acquisitions and sales over the past 15 years that I had never heard discussed in family meetings. The family had bought and sold several smaller properties, apparently generating substantial profits that were never mentioned in the context of our supposedly modest business success. But the most significant discovery came when I researched the corporate structure of our hotel holdings. The properties weren't owned directly by my uncles. They were held by something called the Jareth Fenlorne Family Trust, named after our great-grandfather who had founded the original hotel. I had heard references to this trust throughout my life, but I had never understood its significance or structure. The public records provided limited information about the trust's assets or beneficiaries, but they did include the name of the law firm that had established and maintained it, Ashworth, Kensington and Associates, one of Millhaven's most prestigious estate planning firms. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a lawyer I had met through my graduate coursework, a woman named Ezra Merrow, who specialized in estate and trust law. I didn't tell her I was researching my own family's trust. I presented my questions as academic research for a paper I was supposedly writing about family business structures. Ezra explained the basics of how family trusts worked and what types of assets they typically held. She described how trusts could be structured to provide income to beneficiaries while preserving principal for future generations. She also mentioned that trust documents, unlike property records, were typically private and confidential. The interesting thing about family trusts, she told me, is that beneficiaries often have legal rights that they're not aware of. Depending on how the trust is structured, beneficiaries might be entitled to information about trust assets and income, even if the trustees prefer to keep that information private. She suggested that if I were ever involved in a family trust situation, I should request copies of the trust documents and any related financial statements. Trustees have fiduciary duties to beneficiaries, she explained. They can't simply ignore legitimate requests for information, especially from beneficiaries who are entitled to current or future distributions. I left her office with a new understanding of how family wealth could be structured and managed. More importantly, I had learned that my rights as a potential beneficiary might be far more substantial than my uncles had ever suggested. That evening, I called my uncles and requested a meeting to discuss my role in the family business and my questions about the trust structure. I kept my tone respectful and professional, emphasizing that I wanted to understand the family's long-term plans so I could align my career development accordingly. Uncle Roderick agreed to meet with me Thursday afternoon at his office in the Grandeur Millhaven. "I'm glad you want to have this conversation, Jareth," he said over the phone. "It's probably overdue." I spent the intervening days preparing for what I expected to be a difficult conversation. I organized the research I had compiled and prepared specific questions about the trust structure, the hotels, financial performance, and my potential role in future family business decisions. I also made copies of all my documentation and stored them in a safe deposit box I rented at a bank across town. I wasn't sure why I felt this precaution was necessary, but my instincts suggested that the information I had gathered might become important in ways I couldn't yet anticipate. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and rainy, which seemed appropriate for what I expected to be an uncomfortable meeting. I arrived at Uncle Roderick's office 15 minutes early, carrying a folder with my questions and research materials. The meeting began cordially enough. Uncle Roderick offered me coffee and asked about my work at the hotels. We discussed operational issues and upcoming projects in a tone that was far more collegial than our last family interaction. After about 20 minutes of small talk, I brought up my real questions. "Uncle Roderick, I've been thinking about our conversation at the family gathering, and I realize there are aspects of our family business that I don't understand well. I'd like to learn more about the trust structure and how decisions are made about family assets." His expression became more guarded, but he maintained a friendly demeanor. "What specifically would you like to know?" "Well, I understand that the hotels are held by the Jareth Fenlorne Family Trust. I'd like to understand how that trust works, and what my potential involvement might be as I get older and more experienced in the business." Uncle Roderick leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Jareth, I think you may be overcomplicating things. The trust is a legal structure that helps us manage family assets efficiently. The day-to-day operations are what you should focus on. The bigger picture will take care of itself." "But I'd like to understand the bigger picture," I pressed. "For instance, I've been researching industry benchmarks, and it seems like our hotels should be generating substantial profits. Yet in family discussions, there's always emphasis on modest returns and financial pressures. I'm trying to reconcile those different perspectives." Uncle Roderick's smile disappeared entirely. "Where exactly have you been doing this research, Jareth?" "Just industry publications and public records. I'm trying to educate myself about hotel management and family business structures." "Public records?" His voice became sharper. "What kind of public records?" I realized I had made a tactical error by revealing the extent of my research. Property assessments, mainly. Just trying to understand asset values and market conditions. Uncle Roderick stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking downtown Millhaven. He stood there for a long moment before turning back to face me. Jareth, I think you've been spending too much time on activities that aren't related to your job responsibilities. Your role in this family business is operational support, not strategic analysis or asset evaluation. I'm concerned that you're developing unrealistic expectations about your involvement in family financial decisions. I'm not asking for control over financial decisions, I replied. I'm asking for information that would help me understand my place in this family and plan my career accordingly. Your place in this family is whatever we decide it should be, Uncle Roderick said coldly. And right now, your career planning should focus on doing your assigned job competently, not researching family assets or questioning established structures. I left that meeting with the clear understanding that my uncles had no intention of sharing information about the family's true financial situation. Their evasiveness and defensiveness suggested that there was indeed significant information they were keeping from me. More importantly, I realized that my uncles viewed my curiosity about family finances as a threat rather than a legitimate interest. Their reaction confirmed that I had been deliberately excluded from knowledge that might be rightfully mine. That night, I made a decision that would lead to discoveries far beyond anything I had imagined. I was going to find out the truth about the Jareth Fenlorne family trust, regardless of my uncle's resistance. I was going to learn exactly what my father had intended for my future, and what my uncles had been hiding from me for years. The truth, as I would soon discover, was far more shocking than I could have anticipated. The morning after my confrontational meeting with Uncle Roderick, I called in sick to work and drove 2 hours to Silver Pine, the mountain town where my father had died 15 years earlier. I had never visited the location of his accident, but something drew me there, as I tried to understand what he might have intended for my future. Silver Pine was a picturesque resort town nestled in the mountains, with charming bed and breakfasts, upscale restaurants, and boutique shops catering to wealthy tourists and seasonal residents. As I drove through the main street, I could see why my father might have been interested in establishing a hotel property there. I found the site where his accident had occurred, marked by a small memorial that someone had maintained over the years. Standing there in the crisp mountain air, I tried to imagine what he had been thinking about during those final months of his life, what plans he might have been developing for our family's business and my future role in it. On impulse, I stopped at the Silver Pine Historical Society, housed in a restored Victorian mansion that served as both museum and community archive. The elderly volunteer staff was friendly and helpful when I explained that I was researching my family's connection to the area. What I learned was fascinating. My father had been in discussions with several property owners about potential hotel development sites. He had met with local planning officials, attended town council meetings, and apparently developed relationships with key business leaders in the community. According to the Historical Society's records, he had been considering a significant investment in a luxury mountain resort that would have been the crown jewel of the Grandeur Hotels chain. More importantly, the records indicated that my father had been working with local officials on a development plan that would have created jobs and brought significant tourism revenue to Silver Pine. The project had been welcomed by community leaders and had received preliminary approvals from planning authorities. This information contradicted everything I had been told about the circumstances of my father's death. My uncles had always described his final trip to Silver Pine as a routine inspection of a modest property acquisition. In reality, he had been developing an ambitious expansion plan that would have dramatically increased the size and scope of our family business. I spent the afternoon driving around Silver Pine, looking at the properties that had been mentioned in the Historical Society's records. Several were still undeveloped, suggesting that my father's plans had been abandoned after his death rather than pursued by my uncles. That evening, I returned to Millhaven with a new understanding of my father's vision and ambitions for our family business. I also had growing suspicions about why my uncles had never mentioned these expansion plans or my father's substantial work toward implementing them. The next morning, I made an appointment with Ezra Merrow, the estate attorney I had consulted previously. This time, I was honest about my situation and my need for legal advice about family trust matters. Ezra listened carefully as I described my family dynamics, my uncles' evasiveness about financial information, and my growing suspicions that I was being deliberately excluded from knowledge about my inheritance rights. "Based on what you're telling me," she said, "it sounds like you may be a beneficiary of a family trust, but the trustees are not providing you with information that you're legally entitled to receive." She explained that beneficiaries of family trusts have specific rights, including the right to receive copies of trust documents, annual financial statements, and information about trust assets and distributions. Trustees who fail to provide this information can be held legally accountable for breaching their fiduciary duties. The first step is to make a formal written request for trust information, Ezra advised. The request should be specific about what documents you want to see and should reference your rights as a beneficiary. If the trustees refuse to provide the information, we can pursue legal remedies to compel disclosure. She helped me draft a letter requesting copies of the Jareth Fenlorne family trust documents, including the original trust agreement, any amendments or modifications, annual financial statements for the past 5 years, and a current inventory of trust assets. The letter was addressed to Uncle Roderick as the apparent trustee and was sent via certified mail to ensure we had proof of delivery. It was professional in tone but firm in its insistence on my legal rights to access trust information. While waiting for a response to this letter, I continued my own research into the family's financial situation. I had developed contacts among the hotel employees over the years, and I began having careful conversations with people who might have insights into the business's true profitability. William, the veteran concierge at Grandeur Millhaven, proved to be particularly knowledgeable. During a quiet moment in the hotel lobby, he mentioned that he remembered discussions between my father and the hotel's accountant about expansion funding and investment strategies. "Your father was always talking about growing the business," William told me. "He had plans for new properties, international expansion, maybe even a hotel management company that could operate properties for other owners. He was ambitious in a way that your uncles never seemed to be after he passed." I also spoke with Margaret, the head of housekeeping at Grandeur Westport, who had worked for the family business for over 20 years. She remembered my father as someone who was deeply involved in operational details and financial planning. He used to review the books personally every month, she told me. He would walk through the properties with a clipboard, noting everything that needed attention or improvement. He cared about both the guest experience and the business performance in ways that went beyond just collecting profits. These conversations confirmed my suspicions that my father had been far more engaged with strategic business development than my uncles had ever suggested. They also reinforced my belief that the business had been more profitable during my father's lifetime than my uncles currently claimed it was. 2 weeks after sending the letter requesting trust information, I received a response from Uncle Roderick's attorney rather than from Uncle Roderick directly. The letter was curt and dismissive, stating that I was not entitled to the information I had requested, and that my apparent misconceptions about family financial matters should be discussed directly with my uncles rather than pursued through legal channels. When I showed this response to Ezra, she shook her head in disapproval. "This response is legally inadequate," she said. "If you're a beneficiary of the trust, you have clear legal rights to this information. Their refusal to provide it suggests they're either hiding something or they're incompetent trustees." She recommended that we escalate our approach by filing a formal petition with the probate court, requesting judicial intervention to compel the trustees to fulfill their fiduciary obligations. This legal action would require Uncle Roderick to appear in court and explain his refusal to provide trust information to a legitimate beneficiary. "Once we file this petition," Ezra warned, "your relationship with your uncles is going to change permanently. This is not something you can undo. Are you prepared for the consequences of taking legal action against your family?" I thought about everything that had led to this moment. Years of dedicated work with minimal recognition, the humiliating confrontation at the family gathering, the evasiveness about financial information, and the growing evidence that my uncles had been systematically excluding me from knowledge about my inheritance rights. "Yes," I told her, "I'm prepared for the consequences. I need to know the truth about my father's intentions and my place in this family." She filed the petition the following Monday. According to court procedures, Uncle Roderick would have 30 days to respond with either the requested trust information or a legal justification for withholding it. During this waiting period, I made another decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. I decided to hire a private investigator to research my family's business activities and financial situation more comprehensively than I could manage on my own. The investigator, a former police detective named Jareth Fenlorne, specialized in financial investigations and had experience with family trust disputes. I met with him at his modest office in downtown Millhaven and explained the situation. "What you're describing sounds familiar," Jareth told me. Family trustees who control significant assets sometimes develop a sense of ownership that goes beyond their legal authority. They start making decisions that benefit themselves rather than the beneficiaries they're supposed to serve. I hired Siren to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the Jareth Fenlorne family trust, including research into asset holdings, financial performance, and any business activities that might not be reflected in public records. Within a week, Siren presented me with preliminary findings that were more shocking than anything I had imagined. The family trust didn't just hold the 3 hotel properties I knew about. It held a portfolio of real estate investments, business ventures, and financial assets worth significantly more than I had ever suspected. According to Siren's research, the trust assets included rental properties in 3 different states, ownership stakes in several other businesses, and investment accounts with major financial institutions. The total value of trust holdings appeared to exceed $90 million. Your uncles have been managing a substantial fortune, Siren told me. And based on the trust documents I was able to locate through court records in other jurisdictions, you appear to be a primary beneficiary of that fortune. More disturbing was Siren's discovery that my uncles had been using trust assets for their personal benefit in ways that might violate their fiduciary responsibilities. They had charged substantial management fees to the trust, used trust funds to purchase properties that they lived in personally, and made investment decisions that appeared to prioritize their personal interests over the trust's long-term performance. This looks like a classic case of trustee self-dealing, Siren explained. They've been treating the trust assets as their personal wealth rather than managing them for the benefit of all beneficiaries. As I reviewed Siren's findings, I realized that my father had left me a substantial inheritance that my uncles had been systematically hiding from me for 15 years. They had allowed me to work for modest wages while they controlled and benefited from wealth that was partially mine by legal right. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They had portrayed themselves as modest businessmen managing a family enterprise of limited profitability, when in reality they were overseeing a multi-million-dollar fortune that included far more than just the hotel properties. More importantly, I now understood why they had been so resistant to providing trust information, and why my questions about family finances had made them defensive. They weren't just managing family assets, they were stealing from them. The next phase of my investigation would determine exactly what my legal rights were and what actions I could take to protect my inheritance. But first I needed to prepare for the family gathering that Uncle Roderick had called for the following weekend, ostensibly to address recent misunderstandings and restore family harmony. I suspected this gathering would be their attempt to pressure me into dropping my legal inquiries and accepting their version of family financial arrangements. I also suspected it would be my last opportunity to confront them before the court proceedings began in earnest. I spent that week preparing for what I expected to be the most important family meeting of my life, knowing that the outcome would determine not just my financial future, but also the relationships that had defined my entire adult life. The week leading up to the family gathering became the most intense period of my adult life. I approached it like a military campaign, systematically gathering evidence and preparing for what I knew would be the most important confrontation of my life. Every conversation, every document, every piece of information had to be organized and weaponized for maximum impact. Siren Jareth had expanded his investigation beyond the initial findings, and what he discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of my uncle's management of the family trust. He had located additional court records from neighboring states that revealed the full scope of their financial activities over the past 15 years. Your uncles have been busy, Siren told me during our Tuesday morning meeting at a small cafe far from the hotel district. I found evidence of at least 12 major real estate transactions that were conducted using trust funds, but the profits from these deals were funneled into personal accounts rather than being returned to the trust. He slid a folder across the table containing photocopied documents, bank statements, and property records that told a story of systematic theft. Uncle Roderick had used trust money to purchase a vacation home in Florida, which he then lived in personally while charging the trust for maintenance and management fees. Uncle Garrett had invested trust funds in several business ventures with his political contacts, keeping the profits for himself when these investments succeeded. The most egregious example, Siren continued, is a commercial real estate deal they completed 3 years ago. They used $2.3 million in trust funds to purchase a shopping center in Westfield. then immediately sold it to a development company for $4.1 million. The $1.8 million profit was split between their personal accounts rather than being returned to the trust. I studied the documents with growing anger and amazement. My uncles had been stealing from my inheritance for years, using sophisticated financial maneuvers to hide their theft while portraying themselves as responsible stewards of family wealth. "How much money are we talking about in total?" I asked. Siren consulted his notes. "Based on what I can document, they've diverted at least $8 million from the trust over the past decade. But that's just what I can prove through public records. The actual amount is probably much higher." He had also discovered that my uncles had been paying themselves substantial management fees from the trust, far in excess of industry standards for similar fiduciary responsibilities. They had been collecting over $200,000 annually in combined fees, while telling me that the family business barely generated enough profit to justify my modest salary. These management fees alone represent a form of self-dealing that violates their fiduciary duties, Siren explained. Trustees are supposed to work in the beneficiaries' interests, not enrich themselves at the trust's expense. But the most damaging evidence involved my father's original intentions for my role in the family business. Siren had located my father's personal attorney, a man named Nelson Velthar, who had retired from practice several years earlier but maintained copies of important client files. Nelson agreed to meet with me at his home in suburban Millhaven, a comfortable colonial house surrounded by mature oak trees and carefully maintained gardens. He was in his 70s, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that suggested his mind remained as keen as it had been during his active practice. "I remember your father well," Nelson told me as we sat in his study, surrounded by law books and family photographs. "Elwayne was one of my most thoughtful clients. He cared deeply about preserving family wealth for future generations, but he also believed in fairness and transparency." Nelson retrieved a file cabinet key from his desk and unlocked a drawer containing client documents from his decades of practice. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Fenlorne Family Trust Estate Planning. "Your father revised the trust documents several times during the last few years of his life," Nelson explained, opening the folder to reveal legal documents, handwritten notes, and correspondence. "He was particularly concerned about ensuring that you would inherit your fair share of family assets when you reached maturity. He showed me a draft amendment to the trust that my father had been working on just months before his death. The amendment would have established me as a primary beneficiary, with immediate rights to trust information and eventual control over a substantial portion of trust assets. Your father intended for you to receive detailed financial reports annually starting at age 25, Nelson continued. He also wanted to establish a mechanism for you to assume increasing responsibility for trust management as you gained experience in the family business. These documents contradicted everything my uncles had told me about my father's intentions and my place in the family financial structure. According to Nelson's files, my father had specifically planned for me to be an equal partner in family business decisions, not a subordinate employee dependent on my uncle's generosity. "What happened to this amendment?" I asked, studying the draft documents. Nelson's expression became troubled. "Your father died before he could execute the final version. Your uncles, as successor trustees, chose not to implement his proposed changes. They claimed that the draft amendment didn't reflect his final intentions, but I always suspected they were protecting their own interests rather than honoring his wishes." He provided me with copies of all relevant documents, including correspondence that showed my father's growing concern about his brother's management of family finances. In one letter, my father had written to Nelson expressing suspicions that Roderick and Garrett were using trust funds inappropriately and suggesting that stronger oversight mechanisms were needed. Armed with this evidence, I spent the rest of the week preparing for the confrontation with my uncles. I organized all documents chronologically and by category, creating a comprehensive presentation that would be impossible for them to dismiss or explain away. I also met again with Ezra Marrow to review the legal implications of what we had discovered. She was astounded by the scope of my uncles' apparent misconduct and confident that we had grounds for serious legal action. "This isn't just a family dispute about inheritance rights," she told me. "This is criminal fraud on a massive scale. Your uncles have been systematically stealing from a trust they were legally obligated to protect." She helped me prepare formal complaints that could be filed with both civil and criminal authorities if my uncles refused to make restitution for their theft. She also drafted a comprehensive demand letter that would give them one final opportunity to voluntarily restore the stolen funds before we pursued more aggressive legal remedies. You need to understand, Ezra warned, that once you present this evidence to your uncles, there's no going back. They'll either agree to make things right, or they'll fight you with everything they have. Either way, your family relationships will never be the same. I spent Thursday evening in my apartment, reviewing all the evidence one final time and mentally rehearsing how I would present it to my uncles. I had decided to attend their family gathering, but not as the confused and naive young man who had been humiliated at the previous meeting. This time, I would arrive with documentation that would expose their years of deception and theft. I also made several practical preparations for what might follow. I moved the original copies of all critical documents to a safe deposit box at a different bank. I made copies of everything and stored them with both Ezra and Siren. I even wrote a detailed summary of my findings and sealed it in an envelope that I left with Nelson Velthar, with instructions to open it if anything happened to me. Friday afternoon, I received a call from Uncle Roderick confirming the family gathering for Saturday evening at the Blackstone Valley estate. His tone was cordial but strained, as if he was trying to maintain normalcy while dealing with the stress of the legal petition and my demands for trust information. "I'm looking forward to clearing up these misunderstandings, Jareth," he told me. "I think once we have a chance to sit down and talk honestly, we can resolve these issues and move forward as a family." I agreed to attend, not mentioning that I would be bringing evidence that would destroy his version of honest family relationships forever. Saturday morning, I loaded my car with carefully organized folders, drove to Blackstone Valley, and prepared to confront the two men who had stolen my inheritance and lied to me for 15 years. I had no idea how they would react when presented with proof of their crimes, but I was finally ready to demand the truth and reclaim what was rightfully mine. I arrived at the Blackstone Valley estate at exactly 6 o'clock Saturday evening, 30 minutes before the dinner my uncles had scheduled. The autumn air was crisp, and the mansion's windows glowed with warm light against the darkening sky. For years, this estate had represented everything I thought I wanted to be part of: family tradition, inherited wealth, belonging to something bigger than myself. Now it looked different to me, like an elaborate stage set designed to maintain illusions. Uncle Roderick met me at the front door, wearing a charcoal gray suit and his most diplomatic smile. "Jareth, I'm so glad you came. I've been looking forward to this conversation." "So have I," I replied, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 15 years' worth of evidence against him. Uncle Garrett appeared in the foyer moments later, drink already in hand, projecting his usual mixture of charm and condescension. "Well, look who decided to join us for a civilized discussion. I was beginning to think you preferred communicating through lawyers." "Only when necessary," I said evenly. They led me to the mansion's library, the same room where they had humiliated me weeks earlier. The space looked exactly the same. Floor-to-ceiling books, leather furniture arranged around the fireplace, crystal decanters reflecting the lamplight. But my perspective had changed completely. This wasn't a sanctuary of family tradition. It was the headquarters of a criminal enterprise. Uncle Roderick poured himself a scotch and offered me one, which I declined. Uncle Garrett settled into his usual chair, legs crossed, radiating the confidence of a man who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. "Jareth," Uncle Roderick began, "I want to start by saying that we're family. Whatever misunderstandings have developed over the past few weeks, we can work through them together. Family is more important than money or legal technicalities." "I agree that family is important," I replied, opening my briefcase and removing the first folder. "That's why I'm here to discuss how you've been stealing from our family for 15 years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Uncle Garrett's smile disappeared entirely, while Uncle Roderick's diplomatic expression hardened into something more calculating. "That's a very serious accusation, Jareth," Uncle Roderick said slowly. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims." "I do," I said, spreading documents across the coffee table between us. "Let's start with the Westfield Shopping Center deal from 3 years ago. You used $2.3 million in trust funds to purchase the property, then sold it for $4.1 million 6 months later. The $1.8 million profit went directly into your personal accounts instead of being returned to the Jareth Fenlorne family trust." Both uncles stared at the documents. bank statements, property records, and transfer receipts that Siren had obtained through his investigation. The evidence was undeniable and comprehensive. "You don't understand the complexities of trust management," Uncle Garrett said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Those transactions were legitimate business decisions made in the trust's best interests." "Really?" I pulled out another folder. "Then explain your Florida vacation home. You purchased it with $800,000 in trust funds 5 years ago, but you've been living in it personally while charging the trust $30,000 annually in management fees." Uncle Roderick stood up abruptly. "Where did you get this information? This is private family business, and you have no right to—" "I have every right," I interrupted, my voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm a beneficiary of the Jareth Fenlorne family trust, and you've been systematically stealing from my inheritance." I opened the third folder, revealing Nelson Velthar's documents. This is a draft amendment to the trust that my father was working on before he died. He intended for me to receive detailed financial reports starting at age 25 and to assume equal partnership in trust management as I gained experience. Uncle Garrett leaned forward to examine the documents, his face paling as he recognized the legal letterhead and his deceased brother's signature on preliminary drafts. "Your father never finalized those documents," Uncle Roderick said, though his tone had shifted from diplomatic to defensive. "We had to make decisions based on what was best for the family business and the trust's long-term stability." "What was best for yourselves, you mean?" I replied, opening the fourth folder. "These are records of every excessive management fee you've paid yourselves, every trust asset you've used for personal benefit, and every business deal where you kept profits that belonged to the trust beneficiaries." The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. Bank statements showing trust funds being transferred to personal accounts, property records proving personal use of trust-owned assets, investment documents revealing deals where my uncles had profited at the trust's expense. "According to my investigation," I continued, "you've diverted at least $8 million from the trust over the past decade. But that's just what I can document through public records. The actual amount is probably much higher." Uncle Roderick sat back down heavily, the fight seeming to go out of him as he realized the scope of evidence I had assembled. Uncle Garrett continued staring at the documents, occasionally picking one up to examine it more closely, as if hoping he could find some flaw in my research. "Even if some of these transactions appear questionable," Uncle Garrett finally said, "we've been managing a complex family business for 15 years. We've preserved and grown the family wealth. We've given you opportunities and employment that you never would have had otherwise." "Opportunities?" I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You've been paying me $45,000 a year to manage operations that generate millions in annual revenue, while you've been stealing from the trust that's supposed to provide my inheritance." I opened the final folder, revealing Siren's comprehensive analysis of the trust's true assets and value. The Jareth Fenlorne Family Trust holds assets worth approximately $90 million, hotel properties, rental real estate, business investments, and financial accounts across 3 states. You've been managing a fortune while telling me the family business barely breaks even. Uncle Roderick's head was in his hands now. Uncle Garrett had stopped examining documents and was staring into the fireplace, apparently calculating his options. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady and authoritative in a way that surprised even me. "You're going to return every dollar you've stolen from the trust. You're going to provide me with complete financial records going back 15 years. You're going to resign as trustees and transfer control of trust management to independent professionals who actually understand fiduciary responsibility." "And if we refuse?" Uncle Garrett asked, though he already knew the answer. I pulled out copies of the criminal complaints that Ezra Merrow had prepared. "Then I file these with the district attorney's office Monday morning. Trust theft on this scale is a felony that carries substantial prison time. I also have civil complaints prepared that would require you to make full restitution, plus damages and legal fees." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. My uncle sat motionless, apparently processing the complete reversal of power that had just occurred. For 15 years they had controlled every aspect of my financial life, dangling the possibility of family inclusion while systematically robbing me. Now they face the prospect of criminal prosecution and financial ruin. "You realize," Uncle Roderick said quietly, that if you pursue this course of action, you'll be destroying our family. Everything our great-grandfather built, everything your father worked for, it will all be torn apart by lawyers and courtrooms and public scandal. You already destroyed our family, I replied. You destroyed it the moment you decided to steal from my father's son. You destroyed it when you called me a parasite while living off wealth that partially belonged to me. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just refusing to pretend anymore that theft is family loyalty. Uncle Garrett finished his drink and set the glass down carefully. What do you want, Jareth? Money, control of the hotels, a formal apology. What's your price for keeping this quiet? I don't want your apologies, I said, closing my briefcase. I want what my father intended me to have. Complete transparency about trust assets, immediate restitution for stolen funds, and equal voice in all future decisions affecting family business operations. I stood up and walked toward the library door. You have until Monday morning to decide whether you want to resolve this privately or explain your conduct to criminal prosecutors. Either way, the days of treating me like a grateful employee are over. As I reached the door, Uncle Roderick called out one last time, "Jareth, please, we can work this out as a family. Don't let lawyers and courts tear apart everything we've built together." I turned back to face both men who had shaped my entire adult life through their lies and manipulation. "We didn't build anything together," I said. "You built wealth by stealing from family members who trusted you. I built my life by working for people who were robbing me. Those days are finished." I walked out of that library, through the mansion's grand foyer, and into the cool October night, knowing that I would never return to the Blackstone Valley estate as the naive and grateful nephew they had expected me to remain forever. The confrontation was over. The reckoning had just begun. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I sat in Ezra Merrow's office waiting for the phone to ring. I had given my uncles until 9 a.m. to contact us with their decision about restitution and voluntary compliance. At 9:15, Ezra looked at me across her desk and reached for the criminal complaint files. "I guess they've made their choice," she said. The phone rang at 9:17. "This is Nelson Velthar," came the familiar voice of my father's former attorney. "I'm calling on behalf of Roderick and Jareth Fenlorne. They've retained me to facilitate discussions about resolving the trust matters you raised Saturday evening." Ezra raised an eyebrow at me. Having Nelson represent my uncles was either a brilliant strategic move or a sign of their desperation. He knew more about my father's original intentions than anyone alive, which made him a dangerous choice to argue against my inheritance rights. "Mr. Velthar," Ezra replied, "my client presented clear evidence of substantial trust violations. We're prepared to file both civil and criminal complaints this morning, unless your clients are ready to make immediate and complete restitution." "They are," Nelson said simply. "My clients acknowledge that certain trust management decisions over the past 15 years may have been inappropriate. They're prepared to make full financial restitution and transfer primary trust management to independent professionals." I felt a mixture of vindication and anticlimactic disappointment. After years of manipulation and months of investigation, my uncles were capitulating without even attempting to fight. Part of me had been prepared for a long legal battle that would publicly expose their crimes and fully vindicate my position. "What exactly are they proposing?" Ezra asked. Nelson outlined the terms over the phone. My uncles would return $8.2 million to the trust within 60 days, representing all documented funds they had diverted for personal use. They would resign as trustees and transfer management control to Thornfield Trust Company, a reputable firm that specialized in managing family wealth. They would provide complete financial records going back to my father's death, and they would acknowledge my status as primary beneficiary with full access to trust information and decision-making authority. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue criminal charges and would sign confidentiality agreements preventing me from publicly discussing their misconduct. "The confidentiality provision is non-negotiable," Ezra told Nelson. "My client has every right to discuss his family's financial matters, and we won't agree to silence him about criminal conduct." After several hours of back-and-forth negotiations, we reached a final agreement. My uncles would make complete restitution, resign as trustees, and acknowledge my inheritance rights. I would refrain from pursuing criminal charges, but retain the right to discuss the situation if asked directly about it. The paperwork was signed the following Friday in Nelson's office. Uncle Roderick and Uncle Garrett sat across from me at the same conference table where my father had once planned his expansion of the hotel business. They looked older, somehow, and defeated in ways that went beyond just losing control of family wealth. "I want you to know," Uncle Roderick said as we finished signing documents, "that we never intended to hurt you, Jareth. We thought we were protecting the family business and preserving wealth for future generations." "You were protecting yourselves," I replied without anger. "My father left instructions for my involvement in family financial decisions, and you chose to ignore those instructions because it benefited you to keep me powerless and uninformed." Uncle Garrett, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "What happens now? Do we continue working together in the family business, or is this the end of our relationship?" I had been thinking about this question for weeks. "That depends on whether you can accept that I'm no longer the grateful nephew who works for whatever recognition you choose to give me. I'm an equal partner in this family's financial future, and I intend to act like one." The transformation in my life was immediate and dramatic. Within 60 days, I had access to detailed financial statements showing the true scope of our family wealth. The Jareth Fenlorne Family Trust held assets worth $92.3 million, including the 3 hotel properties I had been managing, residential and commercial real estate across multiple states, and diversified investment portfolios that generated substantial annual income. I moved out of my modest apartment and into a penthouse suite at the Grandeur Millhaven, not because I needed luxury accommodations, but because it symbolized my new status in the family business. I was no longer an employee living on a salary. I was an owner with legitimate claim to the wealth I had been helping to generate for years. More importantly, I began implementing the expansion plans that my father had envisioned before his death. I reopened negotiations with property owners in Silver Pine and began developing the luxury mountain resort that had been abandoned after his accident. I hired experienced hotel management professionals to optimize operations across our existing properties and researched opportunities for strategic acquisitions. The financial results were impressive. Within 6 months, I had increased overall revenue by 15% through improved pricing strategies, enhanced guest services, and more effective marketing. The trust's annual income grew from $4.2 million to nearly $6 million, vindicating my belief that our family business had been underperforming due to my uncle's conservative and self-interested management approach. But the most significant change was personal rather than financial. For the first time in my adult life, I understood my actual worth. Not just the modest salary my uncles had paid me, but my legitimate claim to substantial wealth and my proven ability to manage complex business operations successfully. I also learned the difference between gratitude and submission. For years, I had confused being grateful for family opportunities with accepting whatever treatment my family chose to give me. I had believed that proving my worth required accepting disrespect and manipulation. The truth was exactly the opposite. Recognizing my actual worth required rejecting treatment that was inconsistent with that worth. My relationship with my uncles evolved into something more businesslike and distant. They remained involved in certain aspects of the family business, but as employees rather than controlling authorities. Uncle Roderick managed government relations and regulatory compliance. Uncle Garrett maintained our political connections and handled public relations. Both seemed relieved to have specific responsibilities rather than the broad authority they had previously wielded inappropriately. The rest of the family adjusted to the new power structure with varying degrees of grace. My cousins Callista and Leora initially resented losing their privileged positions, but they eventually recognized that a more professionally managed family business would benefit everyone's long-term financial interests. 6 months after the confrontation at Blackstone Valley, I received a call from William, the veteran concierge at Grandeur Millhaven. "Mr. Fenlorne," he said, using the formal address that had replaced his previous familiar tone, "I wanted you to know that your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. He always believed you had the intelligence and character to continue his work, and you've proven him right." That conversation meant more to me than any financial success or business achievement. My father had seen potential in me that I hadn't recognized in myself. My uncles had tried to convince me that I was dependent on their generosity and incapable of independent success. The truth was that I had always possessed the capabilities I needed. I had just allowed other people to define my worth for me. Today, when I walk through the hotels that I now truly help to own and manage, I see them differently than I did when I was working for my uncle's approval. These properties represent not just family wealth but also my father's vision, and my own contribution to preserving and building upon what previous generations created. The young man who was called a family parasite at that humiliating family gathering no longer exists. He was replaced by someone who understands the difference between earning respect and demanding it, between being grateful for opportunities and accepting exploitation, between hoping for recognition and taking control of his own destiny. Have you ever discovered that you were worth more than the people around you wanted you to believe? Have you ever realized that the approval you were seeking was less valuable than the self-respect you were sacrificing to get it? Tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe for more tales about people who stopped accepting other people's definitions of their worth and started writing their own stories instead. Remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from people who need you to stay small so they can feel big. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.